Gerald wiped his hands on a rag that had not been clean in 3 years and stuffed it back into his belt. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of animal dung, straw, and frying bread from the food stalls near the auction gate. He had not planned to come today. He had come only to price a second-hand bellows pump for his workshop. That was all. The auction yard was packed. Farmers stood in muddy boots arguing over goats. Merchants in fine coats examined horses with gloved hands. Children ran between legs while their mothers called after them. Gerald moved slowly through the crowd, his broad shoulders making space without effort. He was not a tall man, but he was solid, the kind of solid that came from years of lifting engines and hammering iron. He found the bellows pump quickly enough. Too expensive. He turned to leave. That was when he heard it. It was not a roar. It was not even a growl. It was a thin, reedy sound, almost like a cough, coming from the far corner of the yard where the exotic creature pens were kept. Most people avoided that section. The creatures there were either terrifying or dying, and neither made for comfortable viewing. Gerald went anyway. The pen at the very end held a dragon. It was small, far smaller than any dragon Gerald had ever seen in picture books or on the road. Its body was about the size of a large dog, curled tight against the back corner of a rusted iron cage. Its scales, which should have been bright and smooth, were dull and flaking at the edges, the color of old ash. Its ribs pressed visibly against its skin. One of its wings was folded wrong, bent at an angle that made Gerald's jaw tighten just looking at it. Its eyes were half open, glassy, and it breathed in slow, shallow pulls like each breath cost it something. A handwritten sign on the cage read, "Dragon. Young. Unsound. Low reserve." A small crowd had gathered, but none of them were serious. They were there to look, to point, to laugh a little. A heavy-set merchant in a red coat was telling his companion that the creature would be dead before the week was out. A woman with pearl earrings wrinkled her nose and moved away. A young lord in riding boots looked at it the way people look at rubbish on the street, briefly, with mild disgust, then away. Gerald stood at the cage and did not move. The dragon's half-open eyes drifted slowly toward him. It did not lift its head. It did not have the strength for that. But it looked at him, really looked, in the quiet way that sick creatures sometimes do when they are too tired to be afraid anymore. Gerald crouched down to its level. "Hey," he said quietly. Not to impress anyone. Not because he expected an answer. Just because it seemed like the right thing to say to something that looked that alone. The auctioneer was a thin man named Roger with a voice too big for his body. He climbed onto his wooden box and started the bidding with a wide grin that did not reach his eyes. He called the dragon a rare find, an exotic specimen, a creature of wonder. Nobody believed him. The crowd that had gathered offered low, joking numbers. Someone called out 2 copper coins and got a laugh. Gerald raised his hand and offered 40 silver. The laughter stopped. Roger blinked. 40 silver for the dragon. Do I hear more? The heavy-set merchant in the red coat frowned at Gerald. You actually want that thing? Gerald did not look at him. 40 silver, he said again, to Roger. The merchant shrugged and turned away. Nobody else bid. Why would they? The dragon was broken. It was barely breathing. It was, by any practical measure, a terrible purchase. Roger brought his gavel down. Sold. Gerald paid from the small leather pouch he kept inside his coat, the savings he had set aside for a new roof section on his workshop. He did not think about the roof. He thought about the bent wing and the shallow breathing and the way those dull eyes had looked at him from the back of the cage. 2 auction workers carried the cage out on a flat barrow. They set it near Gerald's cart with the enthusiasm of men who wanted to be done with the job as quickly as possible. She bite? Gerald asked. One of the workers shrugged. Too weak to bite anything. Gerald nodded. He sent them away with a tip and knelt beside the cage himself. The latch was stiff with rust. He worked it open with patient fingers, the way he worked loose bolts, no rushing, no forcing, just steady pressure until the thing gave way. The dragon did not run. It did not even flinch. It simply lay there, watching him with those half-open eyes, breathing its shallow careful breaths. Gerald reached in slowly. He let the creature see his hands first, rough, scarred, stained with old grease. He did not grab. He slid one hand gently under its thin chest and the other beneath its hindquarters and lifted it out the way you lift something fragile that has already been dropped too many times. It weighed almost nothing. That fact hit him somewhere behind his ribs. He unrolled his work coat from the back of the cart, a heavy canvas thing, worn soft with years of use, smelling of oil and iron, and wrapped it around the dragon in slow, careful folds. The creature trembled at first. Then, after a moment, the trembling slowed. Its eyes, still half open, fixed on Gerald's face. Gerald settled it against his chest with one arm and climbed up onto the cart with the other. The horse, a steady old grey named Biscuit, flicked an ear back but did not spook. Biscuit had seen stranger things in his years with Gerald. The ride home was slow and quiet. Gerald kept one hand on the reins and one arm around the wrapped bundle against his chest. Every now and then he felt the dragon shift slightly, pressing closer into the warmth of him. Not fighting. Not afraid. Just pressing closer, the way small cold things do when they find something warm and cannot quite believe their luck. Gerald looked down once at the small ashen face peering out from the folds of his coat. The glassy eyes had changed slightly. They were still tired. Still dim. But something else was in them now, something faint and careful, like the very first ember catching in a cold hearth. He looked back at the road. Right then, he said quietly, to no one in particular. "Let's get you sorted." Biscuit plodded on through the cold morning. The auction yard noise faded behind them. Ahead, the road curved toward the edge of town where Gerald's workshop sat, small, cluttered, and warm. It was not much. But it was enough. The workshop smelled of iron and old oil and something faintly sweet from the jar of pine resin Gerald kept on the top shelf. It was a single large room with a low ceiling, a stone floor worn smooth in the middle from years of feet moving back and forth, and a wide iron stove in the corner that Gerald fed with wood scraps every morning. It was never tidy. But it was always warm. Gerald pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried the wrapped dragon inside. He cleared the low workbench nearest the stove with one arm, sweeping bolts and rags and a broken gear housing into a crate on the floor. He laid the canvas coat down gently and folded the edges back so the dragon could breathe freely but still keep the warmth close. Then he lit 2 extra candles and leaned in to look properly at what he had brought home. It was worse up close. The scales along its back were not just dull, several were cracked, edges lifting away like old paint from a wet wall. There was a long shallow scrape along its left side where something had pressed against it for too long, probably the cage bars. Its claws were overgrown and brittle. The bent wing, the one that had caught Gerald's eye at the auction, was folded at a wrong angle because something in the joint had been strained or knocked out of place. Not broken cleanly. Just wrong. Gerald had seen that kind of injury before. Not on dragons. On machines. A hinge forced past its range. A joint stressed until it sat crooked. He knew how to deal with crooked. He went to the back shelf and pulled down his medical tin, a battered flat box he kept for his own cuts and burns. Inside was clean linen, a small bottle of pine oil salve, a pair of thin wooden sticks he used as splints for his own fingers when he caught them in machinery, and a roll of soft binding tape. He pulled a stool close to the bench and sat down. "I am going to touch your wing," he said to the dragon, in the same calm flat voice he used when explaining a repair to a nervous customer. "It will not feel good. But I will be quick." The dragon watched him. It did not growl. It did not pull away. It simply watched with those quiet, tired eyes that seemed far older than its small broken body. Gerald worked slowly. He ran his fingers along the wing joint first, pressing gently at different points, reading what he felt the way he read a seized engine, searching for where the resistance was, where the wrongness lived. He found it. A small swollen spot just above the second joint, hot under the scale. He pressed it once, carefully. The dragon made that thin reedy sound again and its whole body tensed. "I know," Gerald said. "Almost done." He straightened the wing by degrees, slow and steady, one hand supporting the joint and the other guiding the wing back toward the position it wanted to be in. When it was as right as he could get it, he laid the thin wooden sticks along either side of the joint and bound them in place with the soft tape, not tight, just firm enough to hold the joint still and let it rest properly. The dragon looked at its own wing for a moment when he finished. Then it looked at Gerald. Gerald got up and went to the small cooking area in the corner near the back door. He had a pot. He filled it with water from the jug and set it on the small iron trivet above a candle burner. Into the water he put a handful of dried meat strips from the bag he kept for his own meals, a pinch of salt, and a scrape of fat from the tin beside the stove. It was not a fine broth. But it was warm and it had salt and it had fat, and those three things were what a starving body needed before anything else. While it heated he cleaned the scrape along the dragon's side with a damp cloth, working gently around the sore skin. He dabbed pine oil salve along the cracked scale edges. The dragon twitched once but did not try to move away. It kept watching him. That steady, quiet watching that Gerald was beginning to find oddly comfortable. When the broth was warm he poured a shallow amount into a wide bowl and set it on the bench beside the dragon. The dragon lifted its head. The first time it had lifted its head fully since Gerald had brought it inside, and looked at the bowl. Then it looked at Gerald. "Go on," Gerald said. It drank. Slowly at first, in tiny careful laps. Then faster as the warmth and salt hit its empty stomach. It finished the bowl and Gerald poured another shallow measure. It finished that one too. Then it lowered its head back onto the canvas coat and let out a long breath that was almost, not quite, but almost, a sigh. Gerald washed the bowl, banked the stove with a fresh log, and pulled his chair close. He had work orders to review, a ledger to update, 3 repair jobs promised for the coming week. He looked at the papers on his side table. He looked at the dragon. He put the papers down and just sat. The candles burned low. The stove ticked warmly. Outside the wind had picked up, pushing against the workshop shutters in long slow pushes. Inside it was still and warm and quiet. Gerald's eyes grew heavy. His head dipped. He shifted in the chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and fell asleep the way tired men do, not deciding to, just sliding into it. He did not hear the soft sound of small claws on the stone floor. He did not feel the careful, deliberate movement at first, the tiny weight settling against his leg, then shifting, then climbing with great effort and great determination up onto the wide arm of the chair and from there onto his lap. He stirred once and cracked one eye open. The dragon was curling itself into the space between his crossed arms and his chest, turning twice in a small circle the way animals do before they settle, and then it lay down. Its splinted wing was held carefully to the side. Its chin rested on Gerald's forearm. Its eyes were already closing. It was purring. Not loudly. Not like a cat. It was a deep, low vibration that Gerald felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. Steady and slow and warm, like a well-made engine running exactly as it should. Gerald looked down at it for a long moment. He thought about the auction yard. The red-coated merchant. The pearl-earring woman. The joking bids and the rusted cage and the handwritten sign. Unsound. Low reserve. He looked at the small creature sleeping against his chest with its repaired wing and its full stomach and its deep slow purr. He shook his head once, very slightly. Then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. The stove crackled. The wind pushed at the shutters. And in the warm stillness of the workshop, the dragon and the mechanic slept soundly together through the long cold night. Neither of them was shivering anymore. It started with the baker. Gerald had sent his neighbor's boy to the market for salt and dried oats the morning after the auction. The boy had a wide mouth and an even wider habit of talking, and by the time he returned with the salt and oats he had also left behind the story of the mechanic who had spent his roof savings on a dying dragon at Harker's auction yard. By afternoon the street knew. By evening the whole district knew. By the following morning Gerald had 3 people standing outside his workshop door before he had even finished his first cup of tea. He opened the door and looked at them. A woman in a brown coat with a notebook. A young man with ink-stained fingers who worked for the district paper. An old Herbert from the grain store 3 streets over, who had no real reason to be there but who never missed anything interesting if he could help it. Gerald looked at all 3 of them. "Not open for questions," he said. And closed the door. He did not think much more about it that day. He had work to do. A broken axle housing to refit, a gear assembly to clean, and a very small dragon to feed broth to every few hours and check on between jobs. Patch, Gerald had started calling it Patch in his head, for the uneven pattern of lighter scales scattered across its dark gray back, was improving slowly. It could lift its head without effort now. It tracked movement with its eyes. When Gerald crossed the workshop it turned to watch him the way a dog watches its person, steady and calm and completely certain. It still tired quickly. It still slept most of the day. But it was eating better, and the hot swelling at its wing joint had reduced to something Gerald was almost satisfied with when he checked it each morning. He was checking the wing binding on the 3rd morning after the auction when someone knocked at the workshop door with far more confidence than was polite. Gerald opened it. The man outside was not tall but carried himself as if he believed he was. He wore a deep blue coat with a guild badge pinned at the breast, a silver wing inside a circle. Behind him stood 2 younger men with the flat bored faces of people paid to stand behind important men. "I represent the Northern Dragon Guild," the man said. His name, he added, was Mr. Aldrich Fenn. He said it as if Gerald should already know it. Gerald leaned against the door frame. "Right. We have received word that you are in possession of a dragon obtained at Harker's yard 3 days ago. The guild has jurisdiction over all registered dragon breeds within this district. We are here to assess the creature." "It is not registered," Gerald said. "It was sold at open auction as unclaimed stock. I have the receipt." Aldrich Fenn's expression did not change. "That is what we are here to determine." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back and let them in. Patch was on the wide workbench nearest the stove, lying in the folds of the canvas coat, watching the door. When the 3 strangers entered the workshop its eyes moved from face to face with slow, careful attention. Its ears, small flat things that pressed close to its skull, lifted slightly. Aldrich Fenn stepped toward the bench. Patch's lip pulled back. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was small and quiet and entirely clear. The tiniest showing of teeth, still small teeth, still the teeth of a creature that weighed almost nothing, but the message in it was plain as daylight. Fenn stopped walking. He cleared his throat. "As I was saying. If this animal is of registered bloodline, the guild has the right to claim it regardless of how it was sold. Harker's yard has been known to process creatures of unclear origin." "I bought it legally," Gerald said. "At open auction. 40 silver. Signed receipt from Roger Harker himself." He pulled the folded paper from the shelf above his tools and held it out. Fenn took it, read it, handed it to one of the men behind him. The man studied it and gave a small nod. Fenn handed it back. "The legality of the sale is not the only consideration. The welfare of the creature. Its wing is splinted," Gerald said. "It is eating 4 times a day. Its scale condition is improving. What exactly is your welfare concern? Fen looked at the dragon. The dragon looked at Fen. Neither of them appeared to enjoy the experience. The guild can provide proper facilities, Fen said. Trained handlers. Medical specialists. It did not come from proper facilities, Gerald said. It came from a rusted cage with a sign on it that said unsound. Your guild did not bid on it. I did. There was a pause. One of the men behind Fen shifted his weight. The other looked at the ceiling. Fen straightened the badge on his coat. We will be reviewing the matter further. I would advise you not to. He stopped. Because Patch had moved. Not far. It had not leapt or charged. It had simply stood up on the workbench on its 4 thin legs, squarely and deliberately, and taken 2 careful steps toward the edge of the bench closest to Gerald. It stood there now between Gerald and the 3 men, its splinted wing held to the side, its chin level, its eyes fixed on Aldrich Fen with an expression that needed no translation. The workshop was very quiet. Fen looked at the dragon. He looked at Gerald. He looked at the dragon again. Good day, Gerald said pleasantly. And opened the workshop door. Fen left. His 2 men followed close behind. Gerald closed the door. He stood for a moment with his hand still on the latch and let out a slow breath. Then he turned and looked at Patch. Patch was still standing at the edge of the bench. Still watching the door. Its ears were up, its small body straight, every line of it alert and certain. Then, slowly, it turned and looked at Gerald. Thank you, Gerald said quietly. Patch sat down. It curled its tail around its feet. The alertness faded back into its usual quiet calm. 2 days later a different visitor came. This one did not knock with authority. She knocked twice, lightly, and waited. Gerald opened the door to find a woman of about 60 in a plain gray traveling coat, white hair pinned neatly back, a leather satchel over one shoulder and a small notebook in her hand. My name is Agnes Rawle, she said. I am not from the guild. I study dragons. I heard about yours, and I would very much like to meet it, if you are willing. Gerald looked at her. She looked back steadily, without pushiness, without performance. He opened the door wider. Wipe your boots, he said. She wiped her boots and came inside, and the quiet way Patch watched her, no raised lip, no shifted ear, just the calm steady gaze it gave to things it was not afraid of, told Gerald something useful before Agnes Rawle had said another word. Some people you let in. Some people you do not. Patch, it turned out, already knew the difference. Agnes Rawle did not rush. That was the first thing Gerald noticed about her. She set her satchel down on the stool he offered, took out her notebook and a short pencil, and then simply stood at a respectful distance from the workbench and looked at Patch. Not with the cold clinical eye of Aldrich Fen. Not with the gawking curiosity of the people who had stood outside Gerald's door the morning after the auction. She looked at Patch the way someone looks at an old painting they have been wanting to see for a very long time. Patch looked back at her with calm, measured interest. May I come closer? Agnes asked. She was asking the dragon, not Gerald. Gerald said nothing. He watched. Patch did not move away. It did not stiffen. It simply kept its eyes on Agnes as she stepped slowly forward and crouched down to bring herself level with the workbench. She did not reach out. She rested her notebook on her knee and studied the dragon from a comfortable distance, her eyes moving slowly from the tail to the snout, down to the splinted wing, across the uneven pattern of lighter scales on its back. She was quiet for a long time. How long ago did you get the splint on? She asked Gerald. 3rd day after the auction, Gerald said. 4 days ago now. Agnes nodded slowly. Good positioning. The joint is resting correctly. She tilted her head. Did you work from a guide? No, Gerald said. I worked from what made sense. Agnes looked at him briefly with an expression he could not quite read. Then she looked back at Patch. She opened her notebook and began writing in small neat letters, pausing every few moments to look up again. After a while she said, "What do you call it?" "Patch," Gerald said. Agnes wrote that down too. She spent the better part of an hour simply observing. She asked Gerald careful questions about Patch's eating, its sleeping patterns, how it responded to strangers, whether it had made any sounds beyond the thin coughing noise. Gerald answered each one plainly. Agnes wrote everything down. Then, very gently, she asked if she could examine the scales. Gerald looked at Patch. Patch looked at Agnes. Then Patch stood, turned slowly on the bench, and sat back down facing slightly away. Presenting its back and the scattered pale patches of scale with the quiet patience of a creature that had made a decision. Agnes exhaled softly. "Remarkable," she murmured, almost to herself. She reached out one careful hand and ran two fingers lightly along the edge of a pale scale patch near the base of Patch's neck. Patch did not flinch. Agnes leaned in close, studying the edges of the scale, the color beneath, the texture at the border where pale met dark. She examined 3 more patches in the same careful way, then straightened up and stepped back. She stood very still for a moment. Gerald crossed his arms. "Well?" Agnes turned to look at him. Her expression was composed but her eyes were doing something different, bright and careful, the way eyes get when a person is holding something large and important very steady inside themselves. "I need to ask you something first," she said. "And I need you to answer honestly." "All right," Gerald said. "When you bought this animal at the auction, you had not seen it before that day? You had no prior arrangement. You did not know what breed it was?" "I went to price a bellows pump," Gerald said. "I heard it cough. I went to look. I bought it. That is the whole story." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down on the stool, set her notebook on her knee, and looked at Gerald with the steady directness of someone about to say something that matters. "What you have here," she said carefully, "is a kinbonder." Gerald waited. "It is not a common breed. In truth I have only ever read about them and seen one in my life, and that was 30 years ago in a private collection in the South." She paused. Kinbonders are born with a specific quality that no other dragon breed carries. In the early period of their life, when they are young and vulnerable, their minds are open in a particular way. They are searching. Not for food or warmth, though they need those things. They are searching for something harder to name. "What are they searching for?" Gerald asked. Agnes looked at Patch. "For the first soul that treats them as though they matter," she said quietly. "Not as property. Not as a curiosity. Not as something to be managed or assessed. Simply, as though they matter." She turned back to Gerald. "When they find that, something in them settles permanently. The breed has no word in common tongue for it. The closest translation from the old dragon scripts is kinmark. The creature marks that person. Not physically. Internally. In a way that does not fade and cannot be undone." The workshop was very still. Gerald looked at Patch. Patch was already looking at him. It had been looking at him since Agnes began speaking, Gerald realized. Quietly and completely and without any uncertainty at all. "So it thinks I am family," Gerald said. "It does not think it," Agnes said. "To a kinbonder there is no difference between thinking and knowing. You are its family. As completely and permanently as if you had been born into the same bloodline." She folded her hands over her notebook. "No law can change that. No guild claim, no noble title, no amount of money. The bond is not a behavior. It is not a habit that can be broken with time or new surroundings. It is simply what the creature is, now, in relation to you." Gerald was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Fen and his guild badge and his talk of proper facilities and trained handlers. He thought about the auction yard, the rusted cage, the sign that said unsound. He thought about 40 silver and a canvas coat and a bowl of plain salt broth. He thought about waking up in his chair with something small and warm purring against his chest. "What happened to the one you saw 30 years ago?" Gerald asked. "The one in the private collection." Agnes's expression shifted slightly. "Just slightly. Its person died," she said. "The owner tried to rehome it afterward. Gave it to a specialist. Gave it to a sanctuary. It would not eat. It would not sleep. It sat at the door of every new place it was taken and waited." She paused. "Kin bonders do not rebond. There is only ever one." Gerald looked at Patch for a long time. Patch looked back at him with those eyes that had started out glassy and half-closed in a rusted cage and were now clear and steady and full of something that Gerald did not have a word for but understood completely. He pulled his stool close to the workbench and sat down. He rested his forearm on the bench surface. Patch stepped forward without hesitation and laid its chin on his arm, closed its eyes, and began its low deep purr. Agnes Rawl watched them both. She wrote something in her notebook. Then she closed it gently and held it in her lap and said nothing more for a while. There was nothing more that needed saying. The stove ticked warmly in the corner. Outside, the town moved and rattled and went about its business. Inside the workshop, a mechanic and his dragon sat together in the simple and total certainty of what they were to each other. Family. As permanent as iron. As warm as fire. Agnes Rawl wrote her report. She was not a woman who used many dramatic words, and her report was no different. It was calm, precise, and exactly 3 pages long. It named Patch as a confirmed kin bonder of the Northern Grey variety, noted the legal auction purchase, documented the wing recovery, and stated in plain language that any attempt to remove the creature from its bonded person would constitute both a legal violation under the old creature protection statutes and a cruelty that no reasonable authority should wish to be associated with. She sent 1 copy to the Northern Dragon Guild. She sent 1 copy to the district magistrate. She kept 1 for herself. Then she shook Gerald's hand, scratched Patch very gently behind the ear, and walked back out into the world with her satchel over her shoulder and her notebook tucked under her arm. Gerald never saw Aldrich Fen again. A letter arrived from the guild 8 days later. It was written in formal language that used many words to say very little, but the meaning underneath all those words was simple enough. The guild was withdrawing its inquiry. The creature was confirmed as legally purchased private property. The guild wished Gerald well in his continued care of the animal. Gerald read the letter once. Then he used it to line the bottom of Patch's water bowl tray so the wood would not get wet. The noble who had sent 2 representatives to the workshop door in the days after Fenn's visit, a man named Lord Harwick who apparently collected rare creatures the way other men collected paintings, sent a 3rd representative with an offer of 200 gold coins. Gerald sent the representative back with a single sentence. Not for sale. Lord Harwick sent no 4th representative. And then, like weather passing, it was over. The street lost interest. The district paper moved on to other stories. Old Herbert from the grain store still asked about the dragon whenever Gerald passed, but Herbert asked about everything and it meant nothing particular. The workshop went back to being a workshop. Gerald went back to being a mechanic. The only thing that was different was Patch. Patch grew. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and week by week in the way that healthy things grow when they are fed properly and kept warm and not afraid. The dull ashen scales began to brighten. Not to a brilliant color, Patch was a northern gray and would always be a gray, but the gray deepened and smoothed and took on a faint blue undertone that caught the light of the stove in the evenings and made the workshop look like it had its own small weather system in the corner. The cracked scale edges healed over. The scrape along the left side faded to nothing. The wing, once the splint came off, unfolded slowly and carefully over the course of several careful mornings until it sat correctly, still not full strength. Agnes had warned it would take time, but straight and proper and resting as it should. Patch began to help. It started small. Gerald was working on a gear housing one afternoon, trying to hold 3 separate pieces in alignment while also reaching for a bolt, which was 2 hands more than he had available. He muttered to himself about it, the way he always muttered to himself when a job needed more hands than he possessed. Patch crossed the bench, studied the situation for a moment, and then placed one careful foot on the 2 outer pieces, holding them steady without being asked. Gerald looked at the foot. He looked at Patch. Patch looked back at him with an expression of complete practicality. Gerald reached for his bolt and fitted it without further difficulty. After that it became a natural thing. Patch held pieces. Patch kept small parts from rolling off the bench by curling its tail in a loose barrier at the edge. When Gerald needed light in a tight space, Patch would open its mouth slightly and produce a faint warm glow from somewhere in its throat. Not fire, not yet, just warmth and light, like a living lamp held at exactly the right angle. Gerald began leaving space on the bench automatically. He began explaining jobs out loud as he worked, not because he expected Patch to understand every word but because Patch listened with that steady attentive focus and it helped Gerald think more clearly. Some mechanics talked to their tools. Gerald talked to his dragon. It turned out to be very good for business. Word spread in a quieter and more useful way that good word always spreads, person to person, without fuss. People began bringing their repair work specifically to Gerald's shop. Not only because he was skilled, which he was, but because there was a dragon in the workshop that sat calmly on the bench and watched the work with intelligent eyes and did not bother anyone. People brought their children to see. The children stood wide-eyed in the doorway and Patch regarded them with dignified patience and occasionally allowed the very small and very quiet ones to touch its tail. Gerald charged the same rates he always had. He fixed the roof with the money from 3 good months of work. On an evening in late autumn, when the air outside had gone cold and blue and the first real frost was beginning to settle on the window glass, Gerald finished the last job of the day, washed his hands, and sat down in his chair by the stove. He was tired in the good clean way that comes from a full day of honest work done well. He leaned back. He closed his eyes. He heard the soft sound of claws on the workbench. Then the familiar weight of Patch stepping carefully down from the bench to the arm of the chair. Then the slow and deliberate process of a dragon that had grown considerably since autumn began arranging itself across a mechanic who had not grown at all. Patch draped over him like a living blanket. Its chin rested on Gerald's shoulder. Its body lay across his chest and lap, warm and heavy and solid. Its repaired wing folded neatly against Gerald's side. Its tail hung over the arm of the chair and swayed once, slowly, and then was still. And then the purring began. It was not the faint fragile vibration of those first nights. Patch was stronger now and the purr was stronger with it, a deep, rolling, resonant sound that Gerald felt through his whole chest, steady and low and endlessly warm, like a great engine running perfectly in a cold night. Gerald opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his workshop. At the familiar cracks and the lamp hook and the shelf of jars and the bundles of spare cable hanging from the beam. At all the ordinary pieces of the ordinary life he had built in this small warm room. He put one hand on Patch's side. The scales were smooth and warm under his palm, the blue-gray of deep winter sky. Patch rumbled deeper. Outside the frost settled on the town. Chimneys pushed smoke into the darkening sky. Somewhere down the street a door closed and someone called a child in from the cold. Inside the workshop it was still and golden and warm. Gerald closed his eyes again. He had gone to the auction to price a bellows pump. He had come home with something he had not known he was missing. And in the quiet and the warmth and the deep endless purring, with the weight of his dragon across his chest like the most natural thing in the world, Gerald smiled. Just slightly. Just enough.